During his childhood, he was often tortured by the same nightmare. A red snake wriggled and strangled him. Back then, Mikhail Bulgakov, the future writer and the son of a priest, believed that the devil existed. At the age of 15, he lost his beloved father. After that, Bulgakov lost his faith in God. He went through hell before regaining his faith. He became addicted to morphine. He left his first love, the woman who had helped him with his addiction, and started having a relationship with another woman whom he called a witch. Whilst contemplating suicide, he had a vision about the mystery of the crucifixion and wrote a book known today as The Master and Margarita. But Bulgakov himself called it the Gospel of the Devil. Joseph Stalin gave his blessing for him to write this book. The year 1930, Moscow. Bulgakov ripped up his manuscript and threw it in the fire. It immediately went up in flames. The writer reached for his revolver. Life had no meaning for him. His works were not published. His plays were not staged. He was forbidden from going abroad. Killing himself was the only way out, so he placed the gun to his temple. The phone rang. Bulgakov picked up and was dumbfounded. Who's speaking? Who? Stalin? Stalin's call saved the writer's life. Mikhail Bulgakov managed to rescue his novel from the ashes. The idea of this book came to him after he saw the devil for the first time. He decided to rewrite it. In the revised version of the novel, Voland, devil was depicted as Stalin. The year 1900, Kiev. The evil appeared in the form of a big red snake. It crept up to the boy, twisted itself around his neck, and gripped him in a deadly embrace. The 9-year-old Misha shouted and opened his eyes. He was feverish. Nearby, there was the book Vi by Nikolai Gogol that he had recently read. He looked at it and went into a cold sweat. Misha got up, woke his sister, and whispered, "I saw Satan." He and his sister were both scared and started to cry. He only calmed down in his father's arms. "God will protect you. Just pray," said his father. At that moment, Athanasius Bulgakov, a teacher at the Kiev Theological Academy, became seriously frightened. Misha was his favorite son, the firstborn of a large family. His grandparents were priests, and his parents were committed Christians. They read the Bible and prayed every day. Where did their son's visions come from? To protect his son from the demons, Athanasius Bulgakov started to teach him the basics of his faith. He told the boy about God and about Jesus, about the higher justice, about the eye of the omniscience. Little did his father know that within a few years, his little son would renounce the Lord and turn to the forces of darkness. His difficult road back to faith took Mikhail Bulgakov 40 years. He had to reject God, go through 2 wars, a revolution, and a terrible dependence on morphine. He finally ended his pact with the devil. It all began at the age of 15. In shock, Mikhail slumped down on the steps of his house. His father had just died of renal hypertension or nephritis. Over the preceding weeks, he had significantly lost weight, he'd lost his eyesight and suffered unbearable headaches. Finally, he became paralyzed. Misha spent those last months at his bedside praying. On the 14th of March, Athanasius Bulgakov died. And now his distraught son was crying at the steps of their house. "My father can't be dead. Why did God take my father so early?" He believed in him. Why would God leave his wife a widow and his children orphans? An enraged Mikhail Bulgakov raised his eyes to heaven. "I do not believe," he whispered. "If you existed, Lord, you would have saved him." Soon his nightmares returned. In the darkness of his dreams, he decided everything on earth is governed not by good, but by evil. His relatives noticed that he began to read terrible, mystical books. He reread Gogol's books again and again, became engrossed in the history of man's relationship with the devil, and frightened his younger sisters and brothers by reading them excerpts from the book. His interest in the devil became more and more intense. He visited a séance. 3 years after his father's death, he renounced his baptism. His sister wrote, "Misha has finally decided that he no longer believes in God." At that time, Mikhail was feverishly searching for answers. What was going on beyond life and death? What was his dream all about? These questions made Mikhail Bulgakov, the son of a priest, realize that he could never become a minister of church, because prayers were never answered. He would become a doctor and liberate people from the clutches of death. A few years later, because of the terrible events of 1916, Bulgakov would come to regret his decision. He would come face to face with the devil. The love of his life is next to him. It is Tatiana Lapa, Tasia. They met as gymnasium students and fell in love. Now Tasia was his wife. In her company, all his fears disappeared. Together, they planned their happy future. Misha would graduate from university and become a pediatrician. Tasia would give birth to 1, 2, or 3 kids. Bulgakov would never experience such happiness again, but it was short-lived. A year after the wedding, the First World War started. A young doctor who had been a student the day before suddenly found himself on the front. His life had turned into a nightmare. The horrific injuries, amputations, and screams of agony haunted him day and night. Tasia joined the desperate Bulgakov on the frontline hospital. She had educated herself through nursing courses and then gone to her husband. Tasia assisted Bulgakov during the operations, consoled and soothed him. And suddenly, it all ended. The Bulgakovs were posted to Nikolskoye village near Smolensk. They went there hoping for a better life, but they were mistaken. In Nikolskoye, Mikhail discovered that he was the only doctor in the district. Tired and exhausted after the front, he had hoped to rest there. Instead, an endless stream of patients were rushed to his office. He received up to 100 visitors a day. And he had to do everything: operations, childbirths, fever, syphilis and ulcers. He also had to travel for miles in freezing weather to visit his patients. Tasia was always by his side, but her presence could not help him any longer. Mikhail felt that life had no meaning, that his choice of profession was a mistake. He hated himself, his patients, and the fate that had brought him to Smolensk province. Meanwhile, the day that would change his life forever approached. He woke up screaming. He'd had a dream about his father. Mikhail heard him whisper, "God will protect you. Just pray." In the morning, he decided that this was a sign and would not practice medicine any longer. In a corridor, a patient was waiting for him. He was holding a boy who was gasping for air. Bulgakov realized he was suffering from diphtheria. Let this patient be the last one, he decided. There was no time to waste. He had to perform a tracheotomy right away, or the boy would die from lack of oxygen. He still couldn't breathe, as mucus was caught in his throat. The doctor immediately inhaled through the tube, causing the lungs to start working again. But at a cost. Bulgakov was afraid that the mucus had infected his throat. He immediately injected himself with a serum against diphtheria. However, the drug caused severe itching and swelling of the face and a red rash. The doctor decided to ease his sufferings. For the first time, he made himself a sedative of morphine. This was the beginning of the end. He felt he was floating and experienced new colors and smells. And then he saw evil. The same dream, which had been disturbing him for more than 15 years, suddenly became a reality. The fiery snake was strangling him again. And then, a man took its place. He bent over him and said in his father's voice, "Pray, he will protect you." Bulgakov froze. He had come face to face with the ancient demon, Azazello. Azazel was the name of one of the demons that surrounded Satan. It's widely thought that Azazel is the demon who unleashes the power of herbs and roots to people. He teaches them how to change their perception with the aid of drugs. Azazel led him down to a strange sandy road to an old palace. You want to know the truth? Take a look. But the effect of the injection was over. Bulgakov found himself sitting in his office confused, frightened, and excited. He was determined to return to the palace and find out what the demon wanted to show him. The next day, there was no need to take morphine. The rush had disappeared, and there were no medical indications for the injection. But Bulgakov knew that 1 cube of morphine could open up the secrets of the universe and answer all his questions regarding good and evil. He told himself that this would be the last time and fixed himself a new injection. Suddenly, he saw an old palace. A man was sitting on a throne, dressed in a cloak with a bloody lining. At a distance, he saw a cross with a crooked martyr on it. And then he heard a terrible voice. "You renounced him, but for no purpose. He really existed. Listen." The voice told him what had happened in the palace several centuries earlier and the true story of Christ's crucifixion. Mikhail listened and realized that he'd been party to the greatest secret of all time. He felt it was his duty to share the real story of the crucifixion by creating a new gospel. Mikhail knew exactly who had put forward the idea of writing the gospel. He was led to the palace of Jerusalem by the devil himself. He needed to keep injecting himself several times a day, even during appointments. He ended up living in a dream world. Tasia was in despair. Why had she not dissuaded him from taking that first injection? And now it was too late. He wouldn't listen to her and became angry whenever she hid his vial of morphine. He demanded that his wife bring him some more drugs and threatened her with a pistol if she refused. In tears and in shame, she would take his handwritten prescriptions to the pharmacy. At home, Misha, after injecting himself, would kiss her hands and beg forgiveness. The nightmare would continue for a year. And then, the unthinkable happened. We shall have a child. He froze. He feared that the child of a morphine addict would be born handicapped. This would be the price for his knowledge. On Thursday, I will conduct the operation. He'd never performed such an operation before. He turned over the pages of the medical guide for quite a long time before putting on his rubber gloves. The operation lasted for hours. Tasia realized that something had gone wrong. I will never have children. When everything was over, Mikhail made himself a shot of morphine, silently lied down on the sofa and fell asleep. And Tasia, who never believed in God, started to pray for the first time in her life. Dear God, please make this nightmare stop. Her prayers were answered. Mikhail suddenly calmed down. The dream ceased after he had witnessed the true story of Christ's crucifixion. Soon they returned home to Kiev. In order to help her husband overcome his drug addiction, Tasia began injecting him with distilled water instead of morphine. Bulgakov realized what was going on, but he agreed to play along. He didn't need the drugs anymore. Bulgakov would remember the characters from his dreams for the rest of his life. Eventually, they made him give up medicine and start writing his gospel in an effort to answer the questions that worried him so much. Whom had he seen while under the influence in Smolensk? What did the evil spirits want with him? In the terrible year of 1918, he found the answer in Kiev. It took only 1 year and 14 coups for old Kiev to be completely destroyed. Central Rada, Hetmanat, Petlura, Generals Muravyov and Denikin, everything was turned into a bloody massacre. Most of the town's elite either ran off or died. Bulgakov survived. He gave up medicine forever. Now he spent his time at his writing desk, recreating the vivid images from his dreams. He realized that despite all his suffering at Smolensk, he had received a rare gift. He was able to write. In his head, there were thousands of stories dictated by the revolution. The most important was the idea that came to him in Smolensk, to write the Gospel of the Devil. At that time, he started to develop his theory of the seventh proof of the existence of God. 6 unconvincing proofs were already developed by the medieval religious scholars. The 7th one was invented by Bulgakov. The proof was very simple. If the devil exists, then God also exists. Bulgakov was convinced that the devil existed. Coming up next, incidents in the wicked apartment, the real price of the talent, the dreadful sign, a reminder of the devil, betrayal, separations, success, the encounter with Margarita, who helped Bulgakov to create the Gospel of the Devil. That year, Mikhail Bulgakov, a fledgling writer, appeared in Moscow. He aimed to get a job at the newspaper, but what he found was a shattered city full of hunger and fear. There was no work and nowhere to live. Every night, people mysteriously disappeared. In the courtyards of Lubyanka, the engines of trucks were left running to muffle the sound of shots. The enemies of the revolution were executed. An unknown writer could count only on a room in a communal apartment at 10 Bolshaya Sadovaya Street. 6th entrance, 5th floor, in apartment number 50. Bulgakov started creating his character, Voland. After that, the apartment took on a haunted aspect. People said that Fanny Kaplan, who had attempted to assassinate Lenin, had lived at the house, that people had been tortured there, that the neighboring apartments had caught fire. Strange footsteps were also heard, but none of it was true. By moving into that apartment, Bulgakov had entered hell. At that time, the apartment number 50 on Sadovaya Street was one of the first working communes in Moscow. 10 families lived there. Most of them were proletarian. His neighbors were a working couple who often fought, and the wife screamed for help. In the opposite room lived Anushka, who beat her son, Misha. This room belonged to a prostitute. At night, when people knocked at Bulgakov's door asking for Nusia, he answered, "Next door." The intellectual Bulgakov was disliked by his neighbors. "This was the darkest period of my life. My wife and I were starving. I ran all over Moscow. There were no jobs." In that room, Bulgakov spent 3 hard years. He hated this apartment and called it wicked. He suffered from noisy neighbors and the scandals. Therefore, he could only write at night. But it was in this apartment that Bulgakov wrote his masterworks, Diaboliad and White Guard. He was inspired by a portrait, which hung above the table, a portrait of a man in a grey beret, Mephistopheles. He never forgot about his Smolensk visions. He knew he had to write the Gospel of Satan, but instead, he wrote about the things he had lost in Kiev, about his loving family, about love and death, about the war that had destroyed his world. Instead of a novel about the devil, he wrote a novel, The White Guard. All this time, Tasia was near him. She helped him, warmed his hands. She was his first reader and first critic. And then a miracle happened. Mikhail Bulgakov received a proposal to adapt a play based on the novel The Days of the Turbines. It was a fantastic offer. A few months later, the play was triumphantly staged in the Moscow Art Theatre. Moreover, Stalin came to its premiere. He watched The Days of the Turbines with enthusiasm and started to come regularly. He saw the play more than 30 times. No critic dared to argue against it. Overnight, Mikhail Bulgakov went from an unknown journalist to a fashionable playwright. Now he was dressed in a 3-piece suit, wore a bow tie and a monocle. He acquired numerous admirers. Soon, Mikhail grew weary of his dowdy wife. He told her to pretend that they were strangers in public. He flirted with his fans in front of her. Tasia suffered in silence, hoping his behavior would change. They'd been through a lot together. A year passed. Her husband became the darling of literary society. He was envied. Stanislavski praised him. Bulgakov lost sight of his origins. Tasia no longer recognized the man she once loved. Gradually, their marriage fell apart. At this time, a beautiful female admirer appeared in Bulgakov's life, the ballet dancer Lyubov Belozerskaya. She was bright, fashionable and sociable, the complete opposite to Tasia. She was impressed by Bulgakov, liked his original style and sharp language. Soon, Mikhail told his wife, "The 3 of us will have to live together. You, me and Luba." Tasia angrily refused. Bulgakov moved in with his mistress. When leaving, he said to his wife, "Tasia, God will punish me." Feelings of guilt for having abandoned her tormented Mikhail until his death. But in the whirlwind of his new life, he tried not to think about it. He had everything: money, fame, recognition. It seemed that all the hardships were over. The nightmares and demons which harassed him had gone forever. But he still felt restless. Soon he received a reminder of the agreement he'd made. One evening, his wife Luba brought home a book. It was the story of the writer Alexander Chayanov. Having read it, Bulgakov experienced a mysterious horror. Here is that book, a unique edition. Here is a story which amazed Bulgakov so much. It's called Venediktov, or Memorable Events of My Life. It's incredible. The story recounts Satan's visit to Moscow. He wins the souls of Muscovites in card games. But the biggest shock of all was that the protagonist of the story was a student whose surname was Bulgakov. One can only imagine how amazed the mystical soul of the writer must have been by that coincidence. He grew cold when he read the following lines. "Do you know what lies here in this iron box? Your soul is in it, Bulgakov. I'm the king, and you're a worm in front of me, Bulgakov. My power is unlimited, Bulgakov, and my anguish is boundless. The more power, the more anguish." Mikhail Bulgakov interpreted the book as a sign, a terrifying message from the dark forces. It was subtly done using another writer, but it was addressed directly to him. He realized that he must honor the agreement and wrote a novel about the devil, the Gospel of Satan. He had to revive his Smolensk vision and tell the true story of Christ's crucifixion. I often wonder what he was executed for. Maybe because he was merciful and sensitive to everyone, and blessed everyone, and loved everyone unconditionally. Bulgakov dared to write a poem in the midst of an anti-religious campaign. He showed it to the chairman of the Literary Society of Moscow, Leopold Averbach. But he tried to convince Mikhail that Christ had never existed. He advised him to quit this nonsense and write about the proletarian life. Bulgakov, angry and offended, decided to get even with Averbach. He started to write another novel about the devil appearing in Soviet Moscow to punish swindlers and blasphemers. Satan starts his reprisal with Averbach, who in Bulgakov's novel is called Berlioz. This year, he met General Shilovsky's wife and Tukhachevsky's mistress. An incredibly beautiful woman, Helena Nürnberg, his Margarita. They met at a mutual friend's house. They were both unhappily married. Soon, Mikhail and Helena became secret lovers. Bulgakov asked her to leave her family and he would abandon his wife. They would live together and love each other. But Helena did not dare leave her 2 sons and loving husband. 6 months later, Helena broke off the relationship. After that, terrible events started to befall Bulgakov. He submitted 1 chapter of the forthcoming book to a publishing house. When the editor read the first page, his hands started to tremble. Such recklessness! The chapter tells about the crucifixion of Christ. The chapter was not printed, but read with interest in the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. After that, the long and painful crucifixion of Bulgakov began. First, they banned the staging of his play Religionist's Bondage. Then the play Days of Turbans was closed. The literary administration criticized Bulgakov at all meetings. Nobody published his works. Finally, he was left without money, without hope, without faith. It was a year of disgrace, a year of suffering and frustration. He divorced his second wife Luba, and one night, NKVD representatives came to his apartment. They confiscated his diaries, personal belongings, and intimidated him. Driven to despair, Bulgakov was afraid to go out. Overcome with grief, he wrote to Stalin, who had loved the play Days of Turbines so much. Unable to exist any longer, intimidated, knowing that I am forbidden to be published and staged within the USSR, driven to a nervous breakdown, I ask for your patronage before the government considers my expulsion from the USSR. There was no answer. And then, in a fit of impotent rage, he picks up his brainchild. His novel. He rips it in half and slowly, page by page, throws it in the fire. Then he picks up a gun, holds it to his temple, and then suddenly, something incredible happened. The phone rang. Bulgakov picked it up and froze. He was talking to Stalin. Maybe we should let you go abroad. Are you fed up with us? The confused writer answered, "A Russian writer cannot exist outside his country." The voice responded, "I think so too." What an incredible turn of events. After the call, Stalin ordered Bulgakov to take on the position of assistant director at the theater. And in parting, he said, "I would like to meet for a talk." The inspired writer waited for this meeting until the end of his life. He wrote personal letters to Stalin and believed that the Secretary General read them. After that phone call, Bulgakov realized what he had to do. He would create a play with a triple plot. It would be the Gospel of the Devil, the real story of the crucifixion, and a novel about the adventures of evil forces. In Voland's character were Stalin's traits, whom Bulgakov now considered the useful evil. What was the real reason for Stalin's phone call? He did not know that the Secretary General had made a calculated move. Just before that call, Vladimir Mayakovsky had shot himself. Abroad, rumors were circulating that Russian writers were being repressed under orders from the Kremlin. At that time, the General Secretary received a desperate letter from Bulgakov. Stalin read it and decided to make a royal gesture. Save a talented writer, give him a job, and thus demonstrate to the writers that the Tsar knows everything and is kind. Everybody believed it, especially Bulgakov. Now he was restoring his novel with double the enthusiasm. He believed that Stalin would be the first to read and enjoy it. After that, Stalin's traits were evident in Voland. It's obvious in the text that Bulgakov treats his protagonist with sympathy. Bulgakov believed in a fair devil until his death and considered Stalin his secret patron, who can do everything, even bring him back his beloved woman. They met by chance in the street and never parted again. Helena left her husband and became the third wife of Mikhail Bulgakov. They spent 9 blissful years together. Bulgakov worked, read his wife the chapters from the book, and believed that he was protected. He believed that he wrote this novel for Stalin. Moscow at that time was a dangerous city. At night, black cars removed people who were never seen again. Bulgakov was lucky. Stalin often saw his name on the blacklists, but every time he crossed his name out. After 10 long years, the novel was finally completed. A book about God, the devil, love, sacrifice, and modern Moscow with all its purges and repressions. Helena remembered every written word. She embroidered a silk skullcap for him. They were happy, but then the writer made a huge mistake. He decided to humor his imaginary patron, to approach him, to become a writer recognized by the authorities. For this purpose, he began to write a play, Baitum, about the young Stalin. It had to be staged on General Secretary's birthday. Then God intervened and prevented him from doing it. Stalin was scared of having a play about himself. As a result, Mikhail had a nervous breakdown that led to kidney failure. Bulgakov felt that he was losing his eyesight. In 1939, the doctors made a terrible diagnosis: sclerosis of the kidneys. This disease had caused his father's death at the age of 48. Back then, there was no remedy. Mikhail knew he would die the same way as his father. Kidneys will shrink and stop working. Hypertension, dizziness, and severe headaches will follow. I'll become weak, helpless, and as thin as a skeleton. And then everything will end. Six months passed, and everything happened exactly as he predicted. He was almost blind. He couldn't stand the light, lay in a darkened room and in the master's skullcap. But he continued working like a madman. He was afraid of not finishing it. Bulgakov dictated to Helena the last corrections to the book. He had fulfilled his destiny and written the Gospel of the Devil. He clutched the book and whispered, "So that people know." On March the 10th, his wife made a record in his diary. Misha has died. The next day, the phone rang in the apartment. It was Stalin's secretariat. Is it true that Comrade Bulgakov has died? Yes, it's true. They hung up. Bulgakov's dream did not come true. Stalin, who knew that the writer in recent years was working on something special, did not ask to read the novel. But he also did not order to withdraw the manuscript. The novel, The Master and Margarita, was impossible to publish in the Stalin era. Helena hid it for almost 30 years. She waited for the right time to come. The book was published during the Khrushchev era and caused a stir. It was the only book about God and the devil ever permitted in the Soviet Union. Nobody knew that Stalin had helped Mikhail Bulgakov to finish the novel, and that in the original ending, Bulgakov thanked him in a peculiar way. In the last pages of the novel The Master and Margarita, Voland was leaving Moscow with the words, "We have nothing more to do here. Everything else will be done by him, by Stalin." That is how the writer identified one of the bloodiest tyrants of all time. We have nothing more to do here. Everything else